Well, hey there, everybody. It is Wednesday, and I am so glad to be here, and I am so glad that you have joined me for Bible study. Thank you so very much. We are on the Sermon on the Mount. Most of you have been with us every week, and you know that. And so that means chapter 5 of Matthew is where you want to be. Matthew chapter 5, we're going to take a look today at verses 38 through 42. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 42. Okay, keep in mind, I have reminded you of this for the last few times, but I'm going to remind you of it again, and that is, we're right in the middle of Jesus illustrating what he means by greater righteousness. Back in chapter 5 and verse 20, he said that our righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. And we talked a little bit about that. We have, in fact, mentioned it multiple times. The righteousness of the Pharisees, it was an external model. It was one that was really indifferent about attitudes and motives. It was all about getting the externals right. It was very self-focused. It was about receiving, having people look at you and admire you. That was what it was all about. And it was partial. They were very selective in what they chose to obey. And so the whole model of the Pharisees' model of obedience was terribly lacking. It's no wonder then Jesus would say, in the kingdom, righteousness has to far exceed, go way beyond the model of the Pharisees. Now let me give you some illustrations of what I mean, Jesus says in effect. And so that's what he's been doing as he's talked about hate and lust, and he's talked about oaths and vows and things like that. He's talked about divorce. And now we're going to take a look at verse 38 through 42, and that is the fifth of these 6 illustrations of what greater righteousness looks like. Now, the interesting thing about verses 38 through 42, well, I'll tell you what, let's just read verses 38 through 42 first. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." Okay. Now here's what I'll say about these verses. These verses 38 through 42, are maybe the most misunderstood and the most misinterpreted and the most misapplied of all of the Sermon on the Mount. Now that's saying something, because there's a lot of things on the Sermon on the Mount that are misunderstood and misapplied. But boy, I'm telling you, these verses 38 through 42, I think they're at the top of the list of being misinterpreted and misapplied. Well, let's take a look at verse 38. Jesus begins by quoting directly from the Old Testament when he says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There's a couple of places where you'll see that in the Old Testament. I'll tell you what, don't worry about turning over there. I'll just read to you a couple of these passages. Exodus chapter 21, if you want to take a look, that is fine, but you don't have to. Maybe you can look later for yourself. Verses 22 through 24 of Exodus 21 says this, "And if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she has a miscarriage, yet there is no further injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband made demand of him. And he shall pay as the judge decides. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise." Leviticus chapter 24, verses 17 through 20, you will see similarly, "And if a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. And the one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. And if a man injures his neighbor just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. For eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Oops. Sorry about that. I then got halfway through this and went back to Exodus chapter 21. Let me start that again. He says, and if a man injures his neighbor, Leviticus 24, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Okay. So you see, Jesus is actually directly quoting the Old Testament multiple places. Well, now this was a principle, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It was a principle of law known as lex talionis. Lex talionis, which meant the law of proportional retribution. That's what it meant. The law of proportional retribution. Now, the law of Moses was not the first law code to contain this principle of proportionate retribution. The earliest known record of that kind of law was in the Code of Hammurabi. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Hammurabi's Law Code or Hammurabi's Law Code. He was a great Babylonian king. He lived about 100 years or so before Moses. In Hammurabi's Law Code, we find the same principle there, the principle of proportionate retribution of eyes and eye for eye, tooth for tooth, very similar. Well, that principle, the principle of proportionate retribution, was not in the law of Moses in order to sanction revenge. Now, it almost kind of sounds like that's what it's doing. It is sanctioning revenge. It's given the green light for vengeance. But that's not what it's doing. It's not given the green light for revenge. In fact, it's putting the brakes on revenge is what it is doing. It is stopping, it is restraining vengeance. Think about it for a second. Think about human nature. Fallen human nature. When we're injured, when human beings are injured, when they're offended, when they're insulted, when it comes to a response, most human beings want to do more than get even. Most human beings, for every ounce of an offense, they want a pound of flesh. Again, that's just fallen human nature. We're not going to respond proportionally. The Israelis, in order to survive in a world where they're surrounded, and I'm talking about modern Israeli culture, the state of Israel, they're surrounded by nations that want to throw them into the sea, that want to wipe them off the face of the earth. And one of the only ways that they have been able to sustain themselves is through an extraordinarily strong defense. And their principle has always been, they've made it very clear. And when someone has tested them on it, they have found out that the Israelis are not bluffing. And that is, if you hit us with a missile, we will hit you with 100 or 1,000. No proportionate response. They couldn't afford that when it came to their survival, when it comes to their survival. So proportionate response, no, they're not going to do that. This, of course, is not talking about on the state level. This is talking about on a personal level. And that's how it is on a personal level. Like I said, when we are on the receiving end of an injustice or an offense, we are very rarely satisfied with justice. We want more. And what the law of Moses does, what God does here when He states that the punishment has to match the offense, it is intended to guard against the excesses of vengeance. And again, that's what normally comes with personal injury. We're not looking for justice. We're not looking for a proportionate judgment. we are looking for more. We want more than that. And God recognizes that's human nature. And so He put that in the law of Moses to govern His people, to put the brakes on revenge. Well, as we get to the day of Jesus, as we move from Old Testament times in the early days of the Old Testament covenant community of Israel, as we then move into Israel as it existed during Jesus' time, most of those physical penalties, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, that kind of stuff, most of those physical penalties have been replaced by financial damages. But the law of proportionate retribution was still a principle that was recognized by the Jews of Jesus' day. That's why Jesus says what He does. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, you've heard about the principle of proportionate retribution, that's how everything should be. This is how you should relate to others, Jesus is saying. This is what you've been taught as you relate to others. When someone hurts you, you only hurt them back proportionately. As long as your reaction is not disproportionate, then God is pleased. As long as your response to them is proportionate, God is very happy with you. But Jesus says, nope, that's not how it works. Here's how God wants you to behave. Here's how God expects His people to behave. And what He does is He gives 4 illustrations here of how God really expects us to relate to other people. And I'm telling you, and you're going to see as we work through these and read through these principles that are taught in these 4 illustrations here, not only did they run counter to the thinking of the Pharisees and the Jews of Jesus' day, they very much run counter to the thinking of our own day and our own culture. But nevertheless, we need to understand verses 38 through verse 42, this is God's definitive will of how we are to relate to others. Okay, let's look at the first one here, verse 39. So Jesus says in verse 38, you've understood that the law of proportionate retribution is in effect when you find yourself on the receiving end, of an offense. Jesus says, nope, let me tell you how it really is. Verse 39. He says, I say to you, do not resist an evil person. The word resist literally means to set yourself against. Do not set yourself against an evil person. Now, let's understand what Jesus is not intending to teach here. He is not saying that His people should never take a stand against evil. That when we see evil, we should simply step out of the way and we should let evil have its course. He's not saying God's people are not to report crimes. God's people are not to report injustices. He's not saying that. And He's certainly not saying that we are not to allow ourselves, we are to make ourselves into doormats for a hostile world. He's not saying let anyone treat you any way that they want. That's not what Jesus is saying, even though some people have taken this to mean that. To understand what Jesus is saying here, you have to read the whole sentence. You can't isolate this first phrase from the rest of the sentence. Take a look at it. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. You can't stop there. The rest of the sentence is this. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. The key to this is that phrase, whoever slaps you on the right cheek. Now, why in the world does Jesus specify the right cheek? What difference does it make? Oh, it makes all the difference in the world. Jesus' original listeners would have understood what He says. The right cheek. Okay. Now, most people are right-handed. That's just the way it is. It's just the way pretty much it's always been in every culture. There have been some exceptions, but generally most people are right-handed. That is the dominant hand of most people. And so for a right-handed person, to strike someone on the right cheek, it's going to have to be a backhanded blow. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's not talking about a blow that is intended to inflict physical damage. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. It's not something life-threatening. It's not someone just rearing back and absolutely just, punching your lights out. That's not the picture that Jesus is painting here. It's not describing a violent physical attack. It is a backhanded slap in Jesus' day, was intended to be an insult. It was an insulting act. It's the same verb that's used over in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 67 when we read about Jesus himself as he is going to the cross. Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. The idea here is they was insulting slaps, degrading, humiliating. They were humiliating Christ. And so that's what he's talking about here. And so, do not resist an evil person. Those words are spoken by Jesus here in the context of a personal insult. And so what Jesus is teaching here in verse 39 is that we're not to act in a spirit of revenge when we are insulted. When someone insults you, don't set yourself against that person with a spirit of revenge. What he's saying is that subjects of his kingdom, his people, are to be non-avenging, non-retaliatory people. Petty insults, being maligned, being treated with contempt must not evoke a vengeful response. Instead, God wants us to pattern our response to petty insults after Jesus himself. Listen to what 1 Peter chapter 2 said, verse 23. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. No seeking vengeance, no retaliation. Now listen, that's not a new principle for God's people. God has always expected his people to act in this way. It has always been God's will that his people be non-vengeful and non-retaliatory. We think of passages like Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 22, where we read, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will save you. Or 4 chapters later in Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 29, do not say, thus I shall do to him as he has done to me. I will render to a man according to his work. God says, don't do that. That's what God wants of his people. He does not want his people to have that kind of spirit. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And so the summary here of this verse, verse 39, is this is not a violent, life-threatening attack. It is not prohibiting self-defense. It's not prohibiting you defending someone else who is weak and vulnerable. It's not a prohibition against standing against evil and injustices. This is about how we relate to people who insult us. We don't try to get even. We don't seek revenge, and we don't try to retaliate. They've been told, you respond to these things proportionately. Jesus says, no, don't respond to them proportionately. You don't respond at all to these things. No vengeance, no retaliation. Wow. Okay, let's look at the next verse. Verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Now, the shirt here that's mentioned was a type of tunic that was worn as an undergarment. And the coat was an outer garment. It also served most people as a blanket at night. In fact, it was the most important garment. And we know that because of something that the law of Moses teaches us. The law of Moses, this was part of the law system in Old Testament Israel, Exodus chapter 22, verses 26 and 27, that if a man's coat, this outer garment, is taken in a pledge, it has to be returned to its owner by sunset, since it's necessary to protect him from the cold. So the coat was a very, very, very important garment. In Jesus' day, most people would have owned only one coat. They probably had one or two shirts, the undergarment, 1, 2, maybe 3 if they're pretty well off. But most people only had that one coat. Okay, now that we understand this shirt and coat thing, let's look at that again. If anyone wants to sue you, okay, there's an implication here that's really important to understand. You know, we live in a world of frivolous lawsuits. I don't have to tell you that. And so when we hear this, immediately what pops into our mind are all the frivolous lawsuits that are filed every single day. I don't know, maybe you've been on the receiving end of a frivolous lawsuit. And so, again, that's the image that pops into my mind when I hear if anyone wants to sue you. But we got to get that image out of our mind. That's not the implication here. When Jesus says if anyone wants to sue you, he implies that someone has a legitimate claim against you. This is not talking about an illegitimate, petty lawsuit. There are legitimate lawsuits. There are legitimate claims that someone makes on another. And so that's what's being talked about here. This is not talking about robbery. It's talking about someone who has a legitimate claim against you. Well, when a defendant didn't have any money and he didn't have any other possessions, the court would often require the fine be paid by clothing. And although the court could demand the undergarment, the shirt be given, the court could do that. The court could not demand that the coat be given. Again, because the coat was so important for survival. And but while the court couldn't demand that the coat be given as payment, a person could voluntarily give their coat as a settlement. And so what's Jesus talking about here then? Well, he's saying if you've legitimately wronged another, that is, again, if someone has a legitimate claim against you, you've legitimately wronged them. The point Jesus is making is you have to be willing, if you're part of the kingdom of God, you have to be willing to go beyond what the law requires to show your regret for that wrong. To show you're not bitter, you're not resentful for having to make things right. You're going to bend over backwards to make it right. If you've wronged someone and they rightly, payment for that wrong would be in the form of your shirt. Give him your coat too. Bend over backwards to acknowledge that you did something wrong and that you are sorry for doing something wrong. Make it right. Don't hesitate. Don't try to hide what you did was wrong. Don't try to explain it away. Don't try to minimize the significance of it. You need to own it. You need to accept responsibility for it. And you need to go beyond what is considered fair to make it right. Your personal property should be of absolutely no concern. Your sole concern should be making things right. That's what Jesus means there. So if you've legitimately wronged someone, bend over backwards to make it right. Making it right should be all that matters to us. Look at the third one real quick. Verse 41, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Roman law gave a soldier the right to commandeer any civilian in an occupied country to carry their military equipment and their personal items 1 Roman mile. Now, a Roman mile wasn't quite as far as our mile. It was about 1,000 paces. But as you can probably imagine, it was a practice that was infuriating to a local population who was being occupied by Romans. And so in the case of Judea during Jesus' time, it would have been infuriating to the Jewish population. Can you imagine being forced to carry the military equipment and supplies of your occupiers, of those who are oppressing you? Outside of combat, the Roman soldier was probably never more despised than when he forced someone to carry his pack, carry his equipment. Well, Jesus says instead of being outraged, instead of being resentful, look what he tells his followers to do. Go with him 2 miles. Go with, volunteer for a 2nd mile. Well, that would have been outrageous to Jesus' followers. But that's the nature of life in the kingdom. So what does Jesus mean? What's the point of that? The point is this. Again, there's nothing more humiliating than having to trudge for a Roman mile carrying the supplies of your oppressor. Humiliating. Well, what Jesus is saying is that as a subject of the kingdom, even when you're humiliated, you need to respond by doing good to that person. Listen, I told you that this not only went against all of the values of people in Jesus' day, but it goes against all of the values of our day as well. This is just not done. If someone humiliates you, you look for that moment. You try everything you can to get back. And not just proportionately, you humiliate and you take it to a different level when you get an opportunity. If you've been held down, when you get the opportunity, you crush your oppressor. You crush him. No mercy. No mercy. Well, Jesus says, no, here's how you respond to your oppressor. Do good to them. When humiliated, it's like when we get insulted. We just want to strike back. We want to hurt back. We want to humiliate back, but we must not. No vengeance, no retaliation. Instead, respond by doing good. Okay, look at the last one now. Last illustration of this as Jesus responds to this idea of or the law of proportional response. Verse 42, give to him who asks you, do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Okay, when someone asks you for something, we give him what he wants, Jesus says. Now, don't try to apply this literally, in a woodenly literal way as the rule of your life. Because, and I tell you that not because I don't like it, I tell you that because that's not the way Jesus intended it to be. To do that would be self-defeating. To take this in a woodenly literal way, it means we can't ever say no, ever. You do know, right, that there are a lot of people who would love it if Jesus actually expected us to apply this literally and that we could never ever say no to anyone. It would result in a very prosperous class of thieves and con men, and every Christian would be a pauper if we applied it that way. Now, we have to understand that there is an implication here. It's just like there's an implication when Jesus said in verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you. The implication in verse 40 was that someone has a legitimate claim against you. It's not a petty, illegitimate, trivial lawsuit. Well, in the same way, when Jesus said, whoever, give to him who asks you, there is an assumption here that there is an implication here that the person asking has a legitimate need. They're not just trying to con you, and they're not just trying to take advantage of you. The implication is this is someone who has a legitimate need. This isn't the person who walks up to you and says, "Hey, dude, give me your car." You don't go, "Oh, really? Yeah, give me your car." And you go, "Okay." You pull out your keys and hand it to him. Or someone knocks on your door of your house and says, "Hey, give me your house." Well, I'm going to give you my house. You a Christian? Well, yeah. Jesus said, "Give to him who asks." Now get out of here. No, that's a misapplication of this. This is the person, it's not that person. This is the person who has a legitimate need. So the principle that Jesus is teaching here is this. Real generosity. His people need to be people of real generosity to people who are in need. And listen, that's not a new principle among God's people. God has always expected His people to do that. You know, we've talked a lot about the Old Testament. Let me just flip real quickly over to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Show you that God has always expected His people to be generous to those who are truly, genuinely in need. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 7. "If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your hand, in your land. There will always be the needy among you. It's the same today. There will always be legitimately needy people among us. For those who believe that they can construct a system that will do away with all neediness, that is wrong. There will always be the needy, and there will always be the poor. And people need to be reminded that God calls us to have a generous spirit toward others. If there is someone who is legitimately in need and we turn our heart against him, then God is not honored at all. So in these verses, what's Jesus talking about? Well, He's talking about the spirit that we should have toward others. He's talking about how we relate to others. And it's talking about the spirit that was manifested in Abraham when he gave the best of his land to his nephew Lot. It was seen in the spirit of Joseph when he embraced and he kissed his brothers and gave to them generously despite the terrible wrong that they did to him. It was the spirit that would not let David, no matter what, take advantage of opportunities to try to take the life of Saul, even though Saul was seeking to take his life. It's that spirit that we see in Stephen in Acts chapter 7, where he is praying for those who are stoning him to death. That's what this is all about. So how do we respond to others? Jesus says, when we're insulted, we don't insult back. When we wrong someone, we go above and beyond. We bend over backwards to make it right. When we're humiliated, we do good for that person. And when someone's in need, legitimate need, we respond to that need generously. All right. Well, next time, this next Sunday, what we're going to take a look at is the last of the 6 illustrations that contrast the false righteousness of the Pharisees with the true righteousness of God. Until then, stay well. Hope you're doing well. Hope to see you really, really, really soon. God bless.